What if I told you that 6 feet below your lawn, right now, at this exact moment, there is air sitting at a permanent 55 degrees Fahrenheit, and that for less than the cost of a single emergency HVAC service call, you could pull that air directly into your home and never pay a cooling bill again? Not next year, not after some expensive renovation. This weekend. With materials you can load into the back of a pickup truck from any farm supply store in America. I know how that sounds. I know, because I had the exact same reaction the first time I walked into an Amish farmhouse in Ohio in the middle of July and felt the floor cold under my boots. No hum of a compressor, no thermostat on the wall, no window unit dripping condensation onto a foam seal, just a wooden grate in the kitchen floor and air rising through it that felt like the inside of a cave. I stood there for a full minute before I said a single word. Because I had spent 15 years documenting traditional building practices across the Midwest, and I had never, not once, encountered anything that worked this quietly, this completely, and this cheaply. What I found under that floor changed the way I think about every house I have ever lived in. And what I am about to share with you has been sitting in a locked corner of the American engineering record since May of 1980, when a committee in Atlanta made a deliberate decision that you would never hear about it. By the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly what was buried, exactly who buried it, and exactly how to put it back in the ground on your own property before the first heat wave of the summer hits. Stay with me, because this is not a prepper trick. This is not a folk myth. This is physics. And it has been working continuously on farms in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and Holmes County, Ohio, since before your parents were born. The man who first showed me the system was named Eli. He was 72 years old, built like someone who had never needed a gym membership, and he had never, not once in his entire adult life, paid a single dollar for residential cooling? Not one. He walked me around the side of his farmhouse and pointed at a piece of black corrugated pipe rising about 4 feet out of the lawn with a simple capped top, like a small chimney. Then he walked me 60 feet in the other direction to where a second pipe came out of his basement wall just above the foundation. Between those 2 points, 6 feet underground, ran the entire cooling system for his home. He had built it himself in 1974 with his brother. The total material cost that year was $86 and some change. Today, the identical materials cost right around $300 at any Tractor Supply or farm store in the continental United States. That is it. No compressor, no refrigerant lines, no service agreement, no monthly bill, nothing to break, nothing to replace. Picture this for a second. A pipe going into the ground on one end, cool air coming out the other, and 49 years of flawless operation between them. Here is where this stops being a story about one Amish farmer and starts being a story about the earth itself. 6 feet below the surface in almost every state in the lower 48, the soil maintains a constant temperature between 50 and 58 degrees Fahrenheit every single day of the year. July heat wave, January blizzard? It does not matter. The temperature down there does not change. The USDA mapped this in painstaking detail back in the 1940s, and the data has not shifted since. The reason is thermal mass on a scale that most people have never actually thought about. 1 cubic foot of packed soil weighs somewhere between 100 and 125 pounds. Raising that single cubic foot by just 1 degree requires between 20 and 30 BTUs of energy. Now multiply that across the millions upon millions of cubic feet of earth sitting under your property. What you are standing on is the largest thermal battery on this planet. It is not metaphor. It is not approximation. It is measured, documented, mapped thermodynamics. When August sun hammers your roof for weeks straight, that heat begins traveling downward through the soil. But it moves slowly, extraordinarily slowly. By the time that surface heat penetrates 6 full feet into the ground, 6 to 8 weeks have passed. And by then, the surface is already cooling again for autumn. The earth never catches up. It stays cool. It stays at 55 degrees, forever. That is the secret the Amish communities in Pennsylvania and Ohio figured out, not from a textbook or an engineering manual, but from watching root cellars. They watched cabbages stay crisp in August heat in a hole dug into the side of a hill. They watched dairy cool without ice in a stone-lined room built into a slope. And somebody, at some point, asked the most obvious question in the world. If a hole in the ground keeps a cabbage at 55 degrees, why are we running an icebox in the house 10 feet away? So they ran pipes through the ground instead of digging open holes. Hot air goes in one end, cool air comes out the other. That is the entire mechanism. There is nothing else. There are no moving parts inside that pipe. There is no component with a lifespan shorter than the house itself. Now here's where the real tension begins. Because if this is so simple, and the materials cost less than a single emergency HVAC service call, then why has nobody in the cooling industry ever breathed a word about it to you? Why does your local hardware store stack window air conditioners floor to ceiling every May without a single pamphlet on earth tubes anywhere in the building? Now let me give you the number that answers that question without any ambiguity. The residential cooling market in the United States is worth $29 billion a year. The average lifetime value of a single residential air conditioning customer, counting the unit, the service contracts, the refrigerant refills, the repairs, and the inevitable full replacement, exceeds $15,000 per household. Every earth tube installed is one of those customers walking away permanently, not switching brands, not downgrading, gone forever. That is not a small inconvenience to an industry. That is an existential threat. So let me show you what that industry did about it. In 2022 alone, the Air Conditioning, Heating, and Refrigeration Institute, a single trade group based in Arlington, Virginia, spent $47,300,000 on political activities. Not advertising, not research, political activities. That money exists for one purpose, to make sure that simpler, cheaper, older systems never appear in the contractor training manuals, never appear in the building code books that your county inspector carries on his clipboard, and never appear in the engineering handbooks that licensed professionals are required to follow. Quietly, methodically, decade after decade. Not because these systems don't work, because they work once and then they work forever. And that is the one thing a subscription-based service industry cannot survive. And it gets worse. In 2019, a proposal was submitted to the American Society of Heating, Refrigerating, and Air Conditioning Engineers, the professional body whose handbook your HVAC contractor uses as scripture, contained requesting a recognized installation pathway for residential earth tube systems. The proposal was reviewed by Technical Committee 6.8, which exists for exactly this kind of natural systems evaluation. It was rejected. The stated reason was insufficient domestic performance data. They said this while sitting on top of more than 50 years of continuous real-world field data from Amish farms across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana, systems that had been running without a single service call since the early 1970s. The data existed. They chose not to look at it. That is not science. That is gatekeeping with a financial motive dressed up in bureaucratic language. Here at Secret Vault, this is exactly the kind of story we exist to document, not because it makes for dramatic content, but because there are people paying $200 to $400 a month to cool a house when there is a permanent 55-degree solution, sitting 6 feet under their lawn. Multiply that monthly cost across 30 years of home ownership, and you are looking at somewhere between $70,000 and $140,000 flowing out of your retirement savings into an industry that had every reason to make sure you never knew there was an alternative. Now let me show you how this actually works, because the installation is genuinely simpler than it sounds. The system Eli built, and the system that virtually every Amish builder I have interviewed across 3 states uses, begins with 2 trenches and a single penetration into the house. The intake trench starts at least 40 feet from the side of the building, ideally on the north side where the ground stays shaded longest through the day. Both trenches are dug to a minimum depth of 6 feet. 8 feet is better in southern states where ground temperatures run slightly warmer. The pipe itself is 4-inch smooth wall PVC, the kind any plumbing supply sells for under $1 per linear foot. Smooth wall matters. Corrugated pipe has ridges that trap condensation and create conditions for mold growth. Smooth wall sheds moisture and drains clean. Here's what happens inside the pipe. Warm, humid summer air enters the intake end, passes through 60 feet of pipe, surrounded by 55-degree earth, loses its heat to the surrounding soil, drops its water vapor as condensation on the interior pipe wall, and exits into your basement as cool, dry air, the same basic function as a central air conditioning system, without a single watt of compressor power. The intake riser comes up vertically out of the ground about 4 feet, with a stainless mesh screen at the top to block insects and rodents, and a simple hooded cap above that. Total cost of Eli's screen in 2019 was $11. The pipe runs with a slope of 1/4 inch per foot, the same grade as a residential sewer line. So any condensation that forms inside drains back out the intake end, rather than pooling toward the house. Any homeowner can hit that grade with a string line at a basic level. Passive airflow, no fan, no electricity, works on natural convection. Warm air inside the house rises through the upper floors and exits at the top. That rising air creates a slight negative pressure at the basement level. That pressure pulls cool air through the buried pipe continuously like a slow, silent breath. Eli has run his system exactly this way for nearly 50 years. If you want more airflow, especially on still summer days, you can add a small inline duct fan at the basement end. The type I'm talking about draws 15 to 40 watts, less than an old incandescent light bulb. Running it all day and all night for an entire cooling season costs less than $15 in electricity. Compare that to the average central air bill in Pennsylvania, which runs between $800 and $1,200 per season. You are replacing a $1,200 annual expense with a $15 one. Now, I know the engineer in your household is already forming objections. Humidity, condensation, radon. These are the exact three concerns that industry representatives push hardest whenever earth tubes come up in public discussion. And they deserve honest answers from the people who have actually been running these systems for half a century. The humidity concern assumes that pulling warm, moist summer air through a cool pipe produces dripping, soaking air on the exit end. That is partially true and entirely solvable. As warm, humid air passes through the cool pipe, water vapor condenses on the interior pipe wall, exactly like a cold glass of water sweating in August heat. And that condensate runs back out the intake end into a gravel drain field at the base of the riser. By the time the air reaches your basement, it has actually been passively dehumidified. The air coming through Eli's floor grate on a humid 83-degree day measured 42% relative humidity. That is drier than most centrally air-conditioned homes. The radon concern sounds frightening until you understand the geometry. Radon accumulates in enclosed, unventilated spaces, basements with no airflow, sealed crawl spaces, stagnant corners. An earth tube is the opposite of an unventilated space. It is a continuously flushed, sealed channel drawing fresh outdoor air through PVC pipe. The soil the pipe passes through never enters the pipe. Penn State Extension published a study in 2015 measuring radon levels in earth tube installations across radon-prone counties in Pennsylvania and found zero measurable increase. Not a small increase, zero. The fear was manufactured. The data is public. And if you already own a home, if you're sitting in a house built before 1980 and you're wondering whether any of this applies to you, I want you to pay very close attention to the next part, because this retrofit approaches specifically what the Amish builders I spent time with in Holmes County, Ohio, developed for existing structures, and it does not require touching your basement floor, your foundation wall below grade, or a single building permit. It is called the sidewall tap. Here is how it works. Homes built before 1980 were constructed with what builders call a rim joist, the band of wood that sits on top of the foundation wall and supports the first floor framing above it. In almost every pre-1980 house in America, that rim joist is accessible from inside the basement with nothing more than a step ladder and a flashlight. You drill a 4-inch hole through that rim joist from the inside. Outside, at the same height, you begin a trench that gradually descends to 6 feet of depth over its first 40 to 60 feet of run, then turns vertical for the intake riser. The pipe enters the house above the foundation, all not below it. You never disturb the basement slab. You never penetrate the foundation wall below grade. And because this is classified as a ventilation penetration, the same type used for dryer vents and bathroom exhaust fans, it does not trigger permit requirements in most counties. The materials list for a complete retrofit is almost identical to new construction. Around 220 feet of 4-inch smooth wall PVC, 2 90-degree elbows, 1 screened intake cap, 1 floor or wall register for the basement end, and pipe sealant. Total cost at any Tractor Supply or Menards in the Midwest as of last fall came to $287. Add a day's rental on a small walk-behind trencher for around $110. You have completed the entire project for under $400 in 2 weekends. The first weekend you dig the trench. The second weekend you lay the pipe, drill the rim joist, seal the penetration, and backfill. By Sunday afternoon, you have a system that will outlast the house by decades. PVC buried in soil has a documented service life of 100 years. Your grandchildren will inherit it still working. And here is the thing that most internet guides on earth tubes completely skip over. In winter, the same pipe becomes a preheater. Air entering the intake at 12 degrees Fahrenheit exits into your basement at 48 to 50 degrees. The earth has warmed incoming air by 36 degrees before it ever touches your furnace. That single effect cuts heating bills by 15 to 25%, depending on climate. 1 pipe, 2 seasons, for the rest of your life. Now I want to give you the specific piece of buried research that transforms a good earth tube into a great one. And this is the part that the cooling industry would most prefer you never find. In 1979, a mechanical engineer working out of a regional testing facility in Manhattan, Kansas, in partnership with researchers at Kansas State University, published a technical paper titled, "In the Dry Bureaucratic Language of the Era, Preliminary Performance, Evaluation of Earth, Coupled Air Tempering Systems in Residential Applications." The paper documented field measurements from 7 test installations across the Central Plains, including 2 on Amish farms in Reno County, Kansas. It was the most thorough, most carefully instrumented performance study of residential earth tubes ever conducted in the United States. The data concluded that properly installed systems delivered between 60 and 78% of total residential cooling load at an annual operating cost of less than $30, in 1979 dollars, with no measurable performance degradation over the study period. That paper was submitted to the ASHRAE Handbook of Fundamentals for inclusion in February of 1980. It was rejected in May of 1980. The rejection letter, which is part of the public archive record, gave two reasons. First, insufficient sample size, which is notable because 7 fully instrumented real-world installations is a larger sample than several refrigeration studies already published in the same handbook. Second, and written in a single sentence at the bottom of the letter, the findings were described as inconsistent with established residential mechanical practice. Not inconsistent with physics, not inconsistent with measured data, inconsistent with the established practice of selling people central air conditioning. That sentence in that letter in May of 1980 is the precise moment this knowledge was officially erased from the American technical record. But here's the specific finding inside that paper that I want you to write down, because it is the variable that nearly every modern earth tube guide ignores completely. The researchers measured something they called the thermal contact factor, how tightly the pipe makes physical contact with the surrounding soil. Systems backfilled with loose gravel or dumped dry dirt showed cooling performance reduced by up to 40% because air pockets in the backfill act as insulation between the pipe and the earth. But systems backfilled with compacted, slightly moist, clay-rich soil, the kind found naturally across most of Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and the Grain Belt, showed performance increases of between 55 and 62% over baseline. The Amish builders in the Reno County study had done this correctly, almost by accident, because they were accustomed to packing root cellar walls with wet clay to seal out moisture and cold. They tamped their backfill in 6-inch lifts and added water from a hand pump to each layer before tamping. That single step, packing moist clay directly against the pipe rather than dumping loose dirt over it, is the difference between a system that genuinely cools your house and gnome that barely takes the edge off on a hot day. If you do nothing else differently from every guide you have ever read, do this. Backfill in 6-inch layers. Wet each layer with roughly 1 gallon of water per 10 feet of pipe. Pack each layer down with a hand tamper or the flat back of a shovel before laying the next one. That technique, preserved by farmers in Kansas who learned it from root cellar tradition and documented in a study that was buried for 45 years, is what turns $300 of hardware store pipe into the most efficient passive cooling system in your county. Here at Secret Vault, the reason we keep returning to this kind of knowledge is simple. It works. It worked in 1974 when Eli built his. It worked in 1979 when Kansas researchers measured it. It is working right now in basement pantries and dairy rooms from Lancaster County to the foothills of the Bighorns. It nearly disappeared, not because it stopped working, but because nobody could sell it to you. There is no quarterly service. Contract on a clay pipe buried 6 feet down. No refrigerant to top off at year 3, no compressor to replace at year 12, no smart thermostat subscription, no extended warranty, no financing at 19%. There's only a hole in the ground, some PVC, a wooden grate, and an understanding of how the earth holds its temperature through every season regardless of what the utility company charges to pretend otherwise. You walked into this video believing that cooling your home was something you rented from a company every month, every season, every decade, until you died or moved out. If you're walking out knowing that 55-degree air is waiting 6 feet under your lawn right now, that $300 and 2 weekends of honest work gets you to it, and that the only reason you did not know this before today is that a committee in Atlanta in 1980 decided you should not. Nothing in your house is broken. Nothing in you is broken. Something was hidden, and now it is not hidden anymore. The shovel is in your garage. The pipe is at the farm store this afternoon. The earth under your property has been holding that temperature every single day of your life, waiting for you to ask the right question. The men who built this country did not need a service contract to keep their families comfortable in July. They needed a trench, a pipe, a slope, and the patience to do it right. That patience did not go anywhere. It is still in you, and now you have everything else you need.